Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you are in for a treat today because I'm in for a treat today. I'm thrilled to have Shireen Muhiudeen talk to us about ESG, but even more specifically, sustainability. So, Shireen, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today.
Thank you, Tom, for having me. Great pleasure to be here.
Shireen, could you tell us your professional background?
I'm a practicing fund manager, managing equities and private equity in the region or Southeast Asia. I've done so since 1988, so quite a long time.
And what's your current role?
Currently, my firm is 20 years old. We are still managing money, and I do an additional emphasis on engagement. So, engagement with stakeholders, engagement with companies, portfolio companies that we work with.
Shireen, one of the reasons I was so, frankly, thrilled to visit with you today is whatever the politics of ESG might be, whatever the regulators say, I see it as a business driven initiative. And you're talking about it from an investor perspective. So you must see something there also from the business side of things. And I wanted to start off with why do you see ESG or even sustainability as so critical from a fund perspective?
Tom, can I just take you back into time? It was probably in 1997, and I'm not sure if you remember what happened at that time, but we had the Asian financial crisis. And during that time, I was doing one of my company visits, the east island of Borneo, and there was a proposed massive dam, which was three times the size of Singapore. And it started with asking the CFO, what exactly are you going to do with all the wildlife and the villagers? And he turned to me and he said, why do you care? And this is when it struck home to me that making money or making investments with companies who don't care is going to be short lived. And that sort of started me on this move to keep on digging further. All right, you're going to be doing this in your business, but what about the community around it? What about your impact? How are you preparing them for anything that you're going to do? Because you can see in various aspects of business, you cannot act in a silo. You cannot act on your own because eventually something is going to come back to bite you. And I've seen this over and over again in many areas. So I suppose it's also because we want our companies to do well. And sometimes it's not that our companies don't want to do well or they don't care. Sometimes they're just not aware.
That's a great last point because frankly, I don't think we talk about awareness enough. And in many ways, so I do a lot of contract work and I see ESG requirements now in basic contracts on the Texas petrochemical industry along the Gulf Coast. And my small little clients will say, Tom, what do we do? I said, we have to
Right.
start measuring. But could you talk a little bit about the awareness component of what you're trying to bring?
This is why I wrote the book. This is why I've started speaking to people, because I feel that as we get more aware, if we can teach people the basics, then we're not going to fall into the trap, which is what is happening today. And that is this surge of consultants that have come in and bumped up costs enormously. For example, the regulators are saying you need to have annual reports on your sustainability or your ESG practices. And of course, companies are not aware, they don't know what to do. So, what's the best thing they do? They find somebody to write these massive reports that become door stoppers and nobody ever reads. But it costs the companies money. And this is where I feel aggrieved because, for the longest time, you know, I founded my firm in 2004 on responsible investing. And I'm seeing that because of this inflow of requirements to push this agenda, it's becoming cost prohibitive. And you're seeing a lot of pushback because it's not a slow process. People want it immediately done right away. And I want you to give up your business how you're doing it. And I think that's wrong because there's just going to be people saying, look, I can't do it this way. And that's what we're seeing happening.
You focus on the S or the sustainability. Why do you see that as so business critical?
So when you look at the S, and there are various aspects of the S that are so that we can't run away from. Now, the governance structures have pretty much been enforced using Companies Act, listing rules, legal rules on fiduciary duty. So you've got that entrenched in the system. And if you breach those rules, you are going to be fined or you may even end up in jail. It depends what you end up doing in terms of breaking governance practices. And within governance practices, you have the rules and you also have best practice. So best practice, sometimes people play around with because they know they're not going to get fined for anything. Then you move into the S. Now, in the S category, especially maybe not so much in your part of the world, but in my part of the world, migrant labor is massive. So, how you treat your migrant labor is becoming a major problem. So, recently, for example, during COVID, in our area, a lot of the glove manufacturers use migrant labor and they were exporting their gloves to various parts of the world. I know into California, into the United Kingdom. And you could find that many of these companies were breaching laws, safety laws, human rights laws, and this is definitely not measured. The ILO has come out with standards. Some companies are looking at how to enforce better human rights practices. But actually, you're having 6 to 7 people sleep in the same bed. You're having them arrive in your countries with massive debt. And for the first 6 to 7 months, they're unable to even send any money back home. So they're almost living under these burdens of debt. And sometimes they don't even get paid. So then they run away. And then there's this whole social issue that happens because then you have illegal immigrants. So it's a massive problem that needs to be addressed, and investors can address it. They can't just keep on buying glove companies or buying tire companies. And these are big brands, ignoring the fact that these profits are being made at the expense of these laborers. And it doesn't take a lot to make their lives a little better. I'm not saying you shouldn't have them. I'm just saying you should treat them a little better. You just pay them a little bit more. Maybe you just have a little bit less profit.
Couple of responses to that. First of all, I absolutely love that because I'm an advocate that business is not the only solution. There are obviously other players and other stakeholders, but business can be a part of the solution. And you just
Yes.
articulated how business can be a part of the solution. But the second thing is, you talked about the area of the world you live in, Southeast Asia, but it's actually an international concern because a US, a UK, a German, a Brazilian company could all get into legal trouble and
Yes.
certainly stakeholder reputational issues if they're found to have purchased gloves from a supplier that engaged in that type of behavior. So it really speaks to the global nature of sustainability and what may appear to be something that's located in one part of the world, or at least collected there. It really has a worldwide scope. Let me ask you about not the responsibility of the board, but how do you help counsel a board of directors to look at the S issue, recognizing a board is charged with oversight and strategic vision as opposed to a tactical or in the weeds? How do you counsel a board of directors?
I think from the board's perspective today, the cheapest way, of course, with them would be for them just to look at what kind of products they're involved in, look at where the products come from, in fact, do a traceability map, and then start to see is there any way that within their chain that they are seeing any form of foreign labor. That would be my first starting point. The easiest would be, of course, to join a course on traceability. But I think that if we go on a cheaper route, which is what I'm trying to encourage companies to do to create their own awareness, is to see where their starting point is. So if, for example, you're saying a Brazilian company that is buying some part of their product line from Southeast Asia or from another part of the world, they need to look at every step of the way. They need to be engaged to say, from beginning to end, I know all that is happening in my product line. And I think that would be a first start.
I see ESG and certainly sustainability as an overall business process. You're asked to look at your, I'm going to call it risk, but your issues in those areas, put together strategy to manage that, train and educate your employee base and other stakeholders on it, implement, monitor how the strategy works, and then revise as appropriate. I know that's a
Yes.
simplistic approach, but That's how I see ESG as an overall business process. I also see ESG from a different perspective, and frankly, I wish I had thought of this because it's brilliant, but it's simplistic in its brilliancy, which is the following. All of the areas in ESG have always been part of corporations and businesses, and someone was
Yes.
responsible for them, but it was completely siloed. You didn't have anyone looking at this collectively, so you had no strategic vision. In ESG in a corporation, if you have a head of ESG, a head of sustainability, whatever you may call it, or a board committee or a management committee that looks at it, you now have visibility across multiple, I'm going to call them data silos. Do you see that as a valid way to look or think about this, or do you take a different approach?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think this is people were doing ESG in their own way. It wasn't labeled. Because when you think about it, many companies only last business cycle of 8 to 9 years, many companies. And yet you see companies founded years ago, 30 years, 50 years. How did they remain sustainable? So looking after employees, of course, you have unionized, non-unionized. You would always have somebody within that system who was looking at how to ensure that what they were doing was working and was long term. I do think that many of these older companies had sustainability in mind and being flexible, changing with the times. I think that's also key. You can't pretend that be the ostrich with your head in the sand and say, oh, nothing's changing. You've got to be open about it. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think that the issue of having this silo behavior still exists today, which is the problem, where the finance guys are saying we need to keep costs down at all costs. And you're having the human rights or the human resources people in the organization say we need to be more careful where are we getting some of our information from or our products from. There's always this balancing act. And generally, it's the board that will try and find a mediating solution. And you mentioned the word risk, which is absolutely right, because risk is the whole thing factor for many companies.
Let me turn to your book. We are all stakeholders. I absolutely love that title. But let me start off with asking you, why did you write this book?
Okay, so I started writing probably because I felt many people didn't understand some of the complications that we were seeing in the investment world. And I wouldn't name and shame, but I would just talk about companies and some of the problems that I was seeing. And it had a huge following. So what I then did was I published and printed my columns in various volumes, and I would give them away to people, especially when I traveled, because I wanted them to know stories from our part of the world, some of the issues that we were facing. And then COVID happened, which I'd seen many cycles, many crises, the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, the dot-com bust, you name it, I've seen it. And COVID was like no other. COVID was a global problem. The globe shut down. How are we going to get out of this? We needed to make sure that policies by government, by companies are going to be strong and robust enough to get us out. And because I was stuck at home, I decided it's time to write the book because it gave me something to do. It gave me a sense of purpose to share because I felt that if we could share and create more awareness in this very difficult time, and if we can get the policies correct, many companies will bounce back. If we don't get the policies correct, companies will close.
Who is the audience that you were writing for?
Gosh, I think it would be potential investors. I think also boards, people who want to be on boards, people who are already on boards. So it's definitely within capital markets.
In the United States in 2018, the US Business Roundtable issued a document called Statement on the Purpose of a Corporation. And in that document, they articulated 5 sets of stakeholder groups that every corporation has. Number 1, of course, is shareholders, but also employees, people who do business with the company, localities where the company does business, and consumers. Do you see that as a valid framework, or do you add other stakeholder groups in your model?
No, I think that would be all encompassing. These are the big buckets which you're looking at, because I would call them NGOs, non-governmental organizations that are operating, and you've got that under communities. Shareholders, yes. Now that seems, those are the main buckets that you would need. Of course, some areas might have finer details, but in terms of buckets, I think that's a good coverage
Who do you see as some of the key stakeholders in the S or sustainability, or is it really all 5?
in sustainable. I think that when I look at the S, one of the big factors that I'm looking at right now is the issue of the internet and the algorithms on the internet and the damage that they are causing. I think that this is an issue that we as investors, we as citizens need to be concerned about. And this is because the world of algorithms is promoting hate speech. And you're seeing a lot more anger in the world, in many parts of the world, that's growing at a very, I would say, uncomfortable level. You're seeing genocide, you're seeing fighting at the political level, and then at the younger level, you're seeing all these mental health issues with teenagers. And this has come to my attention because I've seen it in various areas, and it's really concerning me in this area of S that I feel corporations need to realize that using all of this technology, we need to understand far more what it's doing. I think that many companies, many individuals, and myself included, do not understand how damaging or what exactly we're doing with technology. And I feel that part of ESG needs to be highlighted and drilled down. We can definitely see there's some concern and red flags being looked at right now because many jurisdictions are paying attention to it. In Europe, they're coming out with some digital safety laws. I think Canada is coming out with it. The US SEC is coming out with it. And I'm hoping that in Southeast Asia, where we have a lot of young users, be it on TikTok or any of these apps, where there is no control what is being put out there and people are using it as search engines. And Tom, this really concerns me as a long-term problem.
So if we can go back to your early example of glove making, I understand the use of forced or even unfair labor in the making of gloves and how I, as a consumer, can vote with my pocketbook by choosing not to purchase. How can
Right.
stakeholders influence corporations around this issue of the algorithms? Do we ask our corporations to look at things more closely, or are there things that you would see as a stakeholding consumer that I might be able to personally engage in?
Yeah, I think that from on this issue of algorithms and tech companies, of course, those that are listed, I do think that the consumer needs to actually start speaking up to the regulators and saying, what exactly are you doing to protect us? I think that this needs to happen. Mental health with teenage problems is just rapidly rising everywhere. Many blame COVID. Of course, COVID is a problem, but now that we're learning more about what these algorithms are doing, it is something that I think regulators need to look at. The boards of these large companies need to look at. And when you look at the boards of these large tech companies, not all, but many of them are controlled by a single person. So really, it's going to be a question of that single person doing the right thing because the boards probably will have limited power, limited input into making sure that some sort of checks and balances happen. You can't have a situation where companies are just making so much money based on advertising and all they're looking at is to make sure that a child stays online looking at whatever he's looking at or she's looking at because that increases ADEX revenue. So I do think that this is a community problem. I think that all of us need to start voicing up. I think regulators need to be doing their bit, governments need to do their bit. And as consumers using it, Of course, it's a lot harder trying to get your children off things. I think every parent would agree that trying to take away a phone from a child is a battle they don't want to start.
Let me ask you to maybe put on your hat and look down the road to 2030, and I hate to use this term, but mid-century. Where do you see sustainability from your perspective as a fund manager and investments in business in 2030 and even beyond?
Tom, I feel very concerned about where sustainability is going. Again, I feel that the way it has been handled, there's a lot of pushback against it because it's very either or. And I think that companies struggling coming out of COVID, some of them not surviving, some of them barely surviving, are not going to have the capacity right now to take on longer term views, which include sustainability. Because the whole purpose of sustainability, or even the conversation, is okay, you need to incur a little bit more cost now because we're taking a longer view. The problem is coming out of COVID, many of them don't have that sort of resource. They're just scrambling back just to make up what they've lost for those who have survived. So, unless we see a change, I actually think it's going to be very hard for ESG to be to have prominence by 2030. I think that there's going to have to be a lot of change. You cannot keep forcing companies to incur so much cost at this point in time, not till the economy starts to recover. Many countries, inflation is totally out of control. Food is a problem. Reliability of products is a problem. So I think that until we start seeing some stability in that portion, ESG is going to take a back foot, unfortunately.
Shireen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself, the topics we've touched on, and most importantly, your book, what might be the best place or places for them to go?
I think to get in touch with me, I'm on LinkedIn. So you just have to look for Shireen Muhiudeen. I'm there. My book is available on Amazon still. Yeah, those would be the main places to find me and catch up with me.
We're going to link to both of those in the show notes. I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thank you very much, Tom, and all the best.